So welcome to this talk of the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. I'm delighted to welcome Anna-Nadine Pike, who is going to be presenting a paper titled Rewriting the Script, the Manuscripts of Esther Inglis. We'll be starting with Anna's presentation, then we'll have a Q&A, and then finally we have the viewing of the original manuscripts for our in-person attendees. I've got the meeting book here. If you would like your name recorded for posterity, then please do fill it in. If you would prefer not to, then feel free not to. There you are, thank you. So Anna-Nadine Pike is the project creator for Esther Inglis 2024 at Edinburgh University Library. The project aims to raise the profile of Esther Inglis and her manuscript crafts through new research, academic publication, and public engagement activities. Alongside this position, Anna is a doctoral student at the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent. Her doctoral research uses the manuscripts of Esther Inglis as a lens through which to understand the role of script, illumination, and materiality in post-Reformation devotional practice in Britain. The intricate manuscripts of Esther Inglis, which you'll see for yourself a bit later, draw together the crafts of calligraphy, illumination, embroidery, and literary composition. They were unique within their time, but shaped by the artistic, political, and social context surrounding them. Esther Inglis was the daughter of Huguenot refugees who settled in Edinburgh in the later 16th century. She produced manuscripts as gifts throughout her life, often presented to royal, noble, or Protestant leaders in support of Scottish politics and in hope of patronage. Thank you. Today, over 60 of Inglis's books are known in collections across the world. Guided by the manuscripts themselves, this session will introduce Esther Inglis and her remarkable work, emphasising the diversity of her artistic practice. It will then trace the afterlives of Inglis's manuscripts across generations of families, into libraries, and through the hands of later annotators and collectors, asking what this can tell us about Inglis's posthumous reception and changing interpretations of her unique manuscript art. So I'm going to pass over to Anna.
Thank you very much, Daisy. Well, I'm delighted to have this time with you tonight to introduce and share the exceptional manuscript corpus of Esther Inglis. This might be a name that's already familiar to some of you. You may have seen some of her books before, or you might be encountering her work for the first time. In each case, what I think I can guarantee is that something tonight will be new to you, because this is what is so remarkable about Esther Inglis. There's always something more to discover and to wonder at. I've been working as the curator for the Esther Inglis project here at Edinburgh University Library for just over a year now, and much of the research output from this project has focused on the variety of Esther Inglis' work, her identity as both a scribe and an artist, her religious practice, her biographical details, and the particular manuscripts of hers which are now held in Edinburgh. And much of this can be discovered in the online exhibition which I launched at the end of last year, which you can see here on the screen. Now, these elements will form part of the talk that I'll be giving tonight, but I also want to add a new dimension to the story of Esther Inglis and her manuscripts, and that's what happens after they were made. This is where I'd like my talk to go this evening. We'll come to think about the provenance records in Inglis' manuscripts, any sense that we might have of her scribal influence, and how perceptions of her work have shifted across the centuries following her death. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the manuscripts themselves, to give you not only a sense of the breadth of Esther Inglis' creative artistry, but also how her manuscripts further the scribal and artistic traditions of their own time, while also combining them with traditions from Inglis' own past. And this is all to show that as a scribe, illuminator, author, and miniaturist, but also as a Frenchwoman, a Scot, and a Jacobean, Esther Inglis' craft is at once grounded within a particular cultural moment and continually exceptional to it. So born in France around 1570, Esther Inglis was the daughter of Huguenot refugees, who, like many others at this time, fled to England or Scotland to escape the wars of religion. Having left their home in northern France, probably Dieppe, the family moved first to London before arriving in Edinburgh between November 1571 and August 1574. London offered them an initial place of safety, given the hospitality offered by Queen Elizabeth I to Protestant refugees. But by the autumn of 1574, the family, and that's Nicolas Langlois, Marie Pressot, and their two young children, David and Esther, were established in Scotland, and here they lived in the Cowgate in Edinburgh, just next door to the French school which Nicolas Langlois opened there. Marie Pressot was herself a skilled calligrapher. This is a letter that she wrote on behalf of her husband in August 1574, and she writes here in at least 4 different kinds of script, and many of them in several different sizes. So we can assume that Esther Inglis learned to write from her mother as a child. But also, while copying from printed writing manuals, as well as being guided by her mother's instructions, Esther Inglis grew up in Jacobean Edinburgh to master around 40 different styles of writing. As a scribe and a pupil, she was influenced primarily by a French writing tradition, following the writing books of Pierre Amont and his pupil, another Huguenot, the writing master Jean de Beauchesne. And the multitude of scripts that she mastered are contained within her intricate manuscripts, which were produced often as gifts and given to carefully chosen recipients in the hope of patronage. These dedicatees were sometimes royal, sometimes members of the Scottish or English nobility, defenders of her Protestant faith, or particular friends and family. Today we know of 63 such manuscripts. And now, as a scribe, Esther Inglis was working in the tradition of manuscript production after print. One effect of the expansion of print technologies in Europe over the course of the 16th century was an increased homogenization in the appearance of a printed text. And this, to an extent, this new technology posed a threat to the place of the professional scribe in an early modern textual culture. So we can read the development of the handwriting manual partly as a response to this expansion of print. The first manual on the art of handwriting appeared in Italy in 1514, and the genre then spread throughout Western Europe across the 16th century. Writing manuals like these were primarily educational books. They were designed to teach pupils how to write in many different alphabets. Sometimes they set out the principles for the fairest or the truest proportions of letters. But they also allowed individual calligraphers to show the plurality of their scribal skills, and more broadly to emphasize the things that the pen could achieve which would be impossible in typeset printing. And so within a developing concern that the printed age was threatening the place of handwriting, these 16th century manuals advocate for the enduring value of script and the creative power that lies within the pen. It seems clear that in the first half of her career, so this is from 1586 up till around the year 1612, the emphasis in Esther Inglis' work is on demonstrating the same kind of scribal diversity. Developing the scripts that she learned from her contemporary writing masters, Esther Inglis' early manuscripts abound with calligraphic variety. She combines this with a range of different decorative styles, from the imitation of printed engravings to painted illuminations. The constant in all her work, though, is that with just 3 exceptions, all of Inglis' manuscripts contain religious texts. This means then that their visual abundance and variety is a means through which to engage with devotional concepts or with scriptural words which she copied from the French and English versions of the Protestant Geneva Bible. And so Esther Inglis consistently marks her difference from contemporary professional scribes by showing her ability to put the more experimental scripts of early modern writing masters to a devotional purpose. Because in her own manuscripts, Esther Inglis uses these scripts not just as calligraphic exercises, but as practical vehicles for the texts of the Bible and the religious verse that she copies. So the effect is that in one of Esther Inglis' manuscripts, the word of God might be written in a script which is reversed or cut in half or too small to see with the naked eye. And I think this has really interesting implications for thinking about the role of script during this period. Is it just a vehicle for text, or is there not some additional understanding of a level of meaning that comes from the visual aspect of words? Esther Inglis certainly seems to have thought so. She actually comments on the effect of her calligraphic variety in a manuscript that she writes for the Scottish military leader Archibald Campbell in 1602. So in the dedication to this book dedication to a manuscript of the books of Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, which Esther Inglis copies in over 20 different styles of script. She writes, and this is translating from the French, that while the variety of script delights the vision, the spirit will be equally raised towards the great creator through the diversity of sentences which her diversity of script conveys. So the idea seems to be that the delight instilled by her calligraphy should not only reflect, but even become conducive to the spiritual delight with which a reader encounters the words of God. The aspect of these manuscripts is typical of Esther Inglis' early work, monochrome, upright, and constructed in many ways to replicate or indeed surpass the appearance of an engraved printed book. Many of her title page designs and the specific examples here of interlinear decoration are copied directly from books printed within Esther Inglis' own lifetime. And indeed, we can use these forms of decoration to think about the books that she herself would have known. So here, and this is one of the manuscripts, one of the items on display, is a metrical psalter by Theodore de Beze from 1579, in which the psalms themselves are separated by strapwork designs, many of which are exactly those which are found in Esther Inglis' early work. On the right as well, this is the note to the reader, which appears in the 1588 French Geneva Bible, again with a strapwork design that I haven't seen elsewhere, which Esther Inglis copies herself. It's important to note that many scribes of Esther Inglis' time were copying elements of printed books by hand. There's an ongoing dialogue between these media, and borrowing from the aspect of a printed page is a late 16th and early 17th century scribal convention. But the sheer accuracy with which Esther Inglis redraws these printed designs by hand is simply not matched elsewhere. And it has the unique effect that part of the reading process of these manuscripts is almost to decode or unravel the page to work out exactly what a viewer is seeing. At times, Esther Inglis' manuscripts lean even further into this idea of decoding, playing with their readers' powers of perception. So the borders of this manuscript, which she made in 1601 for the Frenchwoman Catherine de Bourbon, for example, are actually printed engravings. But everything else in this book has been drawn in imitation of print. And even then, the one exception to this is that the border on Esther Inglis' self-portrait page is actually hand-drawn. And so at every turn, these books complicate any feeling of familiarity which their viewer might be developing. Just as they think they know what kind of book this is, their senses are once again disarmed. And it's useful to think as well about how these kinds of visual tricks might impact a viewer's engagement with the words these manuscripts contain. All of the manuscripts which Inglis makes in this type contain direct copies of the books from the Geneva Bible. And so my suggestion is that the visual abundance here becomes a means of keeping a reader focused on the book itself, captivated by its ever-changing appearance. At the same time, the senses are continually defamiliarized. This manuscript looks so much like a printed book, and yet is not, that a reader is drawn into a new kind of reading experience, through which a text which they may have read over and over again can be encountered as though for the first time. The second group of Inglis manuscripts are the floral illuminated books, which she produces mostly between 1600 and 1609. 20 of these manuscripts survive today, and one of these you'll see later is held here at Edinburgh University Library. Many of these books within that group were made specifically in the years 1606 and 1607, and this period actually coincides with the years that Esther Inglis and her family spent in England, having followed the Jacobean court southwards in 1604. These books have beautifully illuminated title pages with flowers and birds painted against a golden background. And intriguingly, these title pages clearly recall the appearance of pre-Reformation devotional manuscripts, specifically those produced in Flemish schools in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Inside, Esther Inglis manuscripts are written again in a wide variety of scripts, and they're characterized by the addition of individual painted flowers, fruits, or animals throughout their pages. One defining feature of Esther Inglis' floral manuscripts is their integration of older sources with new, and this is true for her botanical imagery, but also for her scripts. So even as their title pages imitate a style of illumination, which by this point was almost a century old, many of the flowers in these manuscripts can actually be traced to early modern pattern books, and these pattern books have an international range. And so again, that tells you something about the range of materials that Esther herself knew. So we can find some of these flowers in an Italian embroidery manual called the Fiori Naturali, the 1586 Clé du Champ by a French Huguenot called Jacques Lemoyne, and the Flemish Flora Dei by the engraver Adrian Pollard. Now, I've spoken elsewhere about the potential for these floral books to become aids to their readers' devotional meditation. My strong sense is that developing the Protestant commonplace that the world is a book in which to read the works of God, this group of Inglis manuscripts speak to the idea that the divine can be accessed by meditating upon a single element drawn from nature. On every page in these manuscripts, Inglis offers her viewer a choice between encountering the divine through religious or scriptural words, unraveling the texts through her calligraphic scripts, or by contemplating a fragment of the created world. Now, these first two groups of manuscripts have occupied nearly all of the published scholarship on Esther Inglis to date, and so I make it my mission to highlight her other manuscript types at every chance that I get. So firstly, we have this small group of miniature psalters, so books of psalms, which Esther Inglis first made between 1612 and 1615, and then again in 1624, which was the year of her death. These manuscripts measure just 80, so like this tool, measure by 80 by 60 centimeters. And in both size and aspect, they closely follow small format printed books of her own time. So you can compare, and they're exactly the same dimensions in real life. You can compare one of her psalters to a metrical psalter, which was first published in 1612. But, and this is also the case, as I said, for her floral manuscripts, these books of psalms combine this adherence to books of her own time with close painted imitation of books that were made more than a century earlier. So a unique element of this group of psalters are the miniature paintings of King David, which precede their main texts. And these paintings, again, follow that particular style of Flemish illumination from books of hours produced between the 1490s and the 1510s. You can see the proximity there. And so this means that we can add to what we know of Esther Inglis' reading practices, which were evidently diverse, religious, humanistic, classical, and often entirely up to date, by showing that she also had an understanding of earlier manuscripts, and specifically earlier religious manuscripts produced well before the Reformation. These miniature psalters were all produced in the years that Esther Inglis spent in England, so it's very possible that she came into contact with Flemish books of hours via the Royal Library. We know from dedications that she made at this time that Inglis was well integrated into the circles of Prince Henry and also King James in London. As in Esther Inglis' early monochrome manuscripts, these miniature books of psalms engage closely with the aspect of printed books, but now in a different way. They're not imitating engraved print, but typesets. And to me, this is a kind of subtler way of showing the triumph of manuscript over and after print, emphasizing not the diversity or variety of forms which the pen can attain, but the understated clarity. By hand, in her tiny Roman script, Esther Inglis is able to achieve a level of perfection beyond what the printing press can produce at this time. And this is something that you'll see in several of her manuscripts that are on display tonight as well. And it's this same kind of impulse, this same kind of quiet triumph, which endures into the final phase of Esther Inglis' work. And these are the books that she made from 1612 until her death in 1624. So around 14 of Esther Inglis' manuscripts are made with this miniature oblong format. And when I say miniature, these books are about that tall. And so they appear like little kind of tablets which really sit within the palm of the hand. And again, these contain religious texts, so either the Quatrain of Guy Dufour or the Octonaire of Antoine de la Roche-Chandieu, and these were both poetry cycles that were very popular at the time. 4 of these miniature horizontal manuscripts were made at the very start of Esther Inglis' career, between 1599 and 1600, and these manuscripts maintain the calligraphic variety of her early work. But the rest were produced in her final years, in which her preference seems to be for simplicity over diversity. In this last phase, she works only in scripts which imitate and in many ways surpass print. It could be that this is due to her own limitations at this time. We do know that around the year 1612, Esther Inglis had what she described as a great ague or illness. But I also think that if Esther Inglis' overall aim as a scribe is to remind her viewers time and again of the power of handwriting, and to do this particularly at a time where the printed typeset book was expanding rapidly, then there's something kind of quietly revolutionary about producing a handwritten book that imitates type with a perfection that print simply cannot attain in this period. There's an interesting tension at the heart of any study of Esther Inglis. On the one hand, more than 60 of her manuscripts have been survived and preserved across the past 400 years. On the other hand, though, very little is known about Esther Inglis herself. Archival records can tell us, for example, when her children were born. We have her will and her testament. We have some details of her husband's career, Bartolomeo, and 2 records in the Privy Purse accounts show her receiving payments from the household of Prince Henry. But beyond this, the trail still runs quite cold. I'm often asked, for example, if we know how her work was received, what people within the Jacobean court thought of her manuscripts, and even whether she was considered controversial within her own time. In many cases, the fact is that we simply don't know. We have a wealth of detail contained within Esther Inglis' manuscripts themselves, but a near silence surrounding them. In the second part of my talk tonight, though, I want to consider where we can look for any signs of Esther Inglis' reception. So thinking not only about who knew her, but what they thought of her work, and how far any sense that we have of her own intention for the role of her manuscripts are borne out in their use across time. So one thing that we can do is think about the different individuals who clearly were familiar with Esther Inglis and her manuscripts during her lifetime, and use this to consider the wider circles in which her work would have been known beyond her immediate dedicatees. So, for example, the manuscripts that she made between 1599 and 1602 all contain laudatory verses composed by 3 Presbyterian Scottish writers, the reformer and theologian Andrew Melville, the writer John Johnston, and the first principal of the University of Edinburgh, Robert Rollock. In her early work then, Esther Inglis makes an active choice to associate herself with these names, and by extension with the Reformed Presbyterian religious position for which they advocated. So here we can see her reception within Calvinist circles within Scotland, and this develops what we can say of her lifelong Huguenot identity. A further Scottish writer, and this was probably George Douglas of Mordington, also translated a French verse praising Esther Inglis' skills into Scots. The original French verse, and you can see just the start of it there, was written by the renowned Dutch calligrapher Jan van der Velde. For someone like Velde to have encountered Esther Inglis' work, it must have made its way to the Netherlands within her own lifetime. And so we might imagine that Velde saw the manuscript which Inglis made for Prince Maurice of Nassau in 1599. Velde's verse extols Esther Inglis' handwriting, but then concludes with a description of ta plume fidèle, laquelle tu sais mieux que femme manière, your faithful pen, the which you know better than any woman how to use. I find it interesting that there's a gendered dimension here. For Velde, a male calligrapher, Esther Inglis can write better than any woman. I wonder why this should not just be anyone of her own time, regardless of their gender. But if Velde emphasizes Esther Inglis' womanhood in praising her calligraphic skills, this is tempered by the near-contemporary writings of a Scottish calligrapher and professional scribe called David Brown. In his 1638 publication on handwriting, called The Introduction, he upholds Esther Inglis as the leading writer of her time in Scotland. And he says this: "Surely the most rare and curious writs and works of one woman, Esther Inglis by name, which are extant both in His Majesty's Library at St. James's and in the University of Oxford, and in many other places elsewhere, may be patterns and examples as well for practice as teaching, both to all the men and women, professors and others, that either are or have been in Europe these many years." So from this we can tell that in the later part of her life, Esther Inglis' craft was known to contemporary professional writers in Scotland, even though she herself did not work as a professional calligrapher. And she was known, moreover, to the very kinds of writing masters whose handwriting manuals she not only used in her own manuscripts, but transcended. And she is known to the extent that her work is harnessed to aid David Brown's longer argument for Scotland's right to be celebrated alongside any other country in Europe for the quality of the handwriting that it can produce. What we are seeing here is the conscious construction as early as 1638 of a Scottish calligraphic tradition. To David Brown, Esther Inglis' manuscripts should be upheld as exemplars for any aspiring writer. They are designed to be copied from, and above all, they are a touchstone for the manuscript arts in Western Europe in the early 17th century. And so this usefully tells us the extent to which Esther Inglis was celebrated not just as a scribe, but a Scottish scribe in the years following her death. But praising Esther Inglis as an individual is not David Brown's only motive here. He then goes on to say, and besides her, there be many other excellent writers in that kingdom, such as these: and he names Master Alexander Patterson, John Matheson, Charles Geddy, John Peter, James Clark, and Hugh Wallace. So Brown's list, very helpfully, also gives us other specific scribes against which Esther Inglis' writing can be and was compared. And we can use these individuals to further nuance Esther Inglis' exceptionality today, just as Brown himself was doing 400 years ago. So we can start with John Matheson, a handwriting teacher who worked in Edinburgh, whose work is preserved today in these fragments which are pasted into a commonplace book, which is now held in the National Library of New Zealand. We can see from these examples, which were presumably made for his pupils, that John Matheson can write in quite a high-grade secretary style, but he's also proficient in 3 different kinds of reverse writing, and he's demonstrating that at the bottom. Another of the scribes that David Brown names is Hugh Wallace, and by chance I recently found this name among the calligraphic pen trials which precede a presentation copy of the Scottish courtier and theologian James Semple's tract on the religious mass. Although Wallace demonstrates his creative penwork in these trial pages, the text of the manuscript itself is written in a fine Roman hand, with a layout and an aspect that clearly refers to that of a printed book. And so even in these 2 examples of Matheson and Wallace, we can draw comparisons to 2 key elements of Esther Inglis' scribal practice: her ability to work in multiple different scripts on the one hand, and her close imitation of print on the other. But through these comparisons, we are also reminded of the degree to which Esther Inglis continually outshines her contemporaries. There are errors and irregularities when Matheson's reversed writing is mirrored, which are simply not found in Esther Inglis' own work. Brown still separates Esther Inglis from his list of other excellent writers, acknowledging the superiority of her skills and upholding her really as the preeminent example of what a Scottish scribe is able to achieve. Given David Brown's assertion that her manuscripts offer examples for practice as well as teaching, we might expect that the exceptionality of Esther Inglis' work would have had at least some sort of scribal influence on the individuals who encountered it. Interestingly, Esther Inglis seems in no way to have encouraged such influence. Unlike the other named scribes in Brown's list, she was not a teacher of writing, nor do we currently have any evidence for her advertising her skills beyond the immediate settings or circles in which her work was known. Nearly all of her books were produced for patronage rather than by request, and on the rare occasion that she wrote on commissions from others, these were people that were very close to her, so it was more of a kind of personal favor. To a great extent, then, evidence for Esther Inglis' reception through scribal influence within her own lifetime must remain speculative. But occasionally, manuscripts can be found which suggest that they were produced with some reference to Esther Inglis' work. And one such example is this manuscript of Prayers and Meditations, which actually until the 1990s was attributed to Esther Inglis herself. This attribution was presumably based on the parallels to the visual form of Esther Inglis' early manuscript type. And we can see that in the layout of the page, also the kind of interlinear decorations as well, and also the calligraphic scripts and embellishments that are used here. Unfortunately, there are no names in this book, but parts of its text make it clear that it was made in Scotland. So we can speculate as to whether its scribe was the recipient of one of Esther Inglis' early monochrome manuscripts, all of which were produced while she was living in Edinburgh. When considering how the recipients of Esther Inglis' manuscripts would have interpreted her work, there are 2 further possibilities for evidence. The first is how Esther Inglis herself writes about her desire for her books to be used. As has often been noted in scholarship on Esther Inglis, many of the dedicatory letters, and these preface the starts of her manuscript, ask their recipients to store these books in their cabinets. 10 of Esther Inglis' dedicatory letters contain these kinds of encouragements, as you can see here in the manuscript that she gave to Elizabeth Norris, Lady Erskine, in 1606. We've got she writes to Elizabeth, describing her illuminated manuscript as these few blossoms which in all humility I offer to your ladyship, praying you accept thereof, and give the same some hidden corner in your cabinet. In part, of course, this is a performance of modesty. the implication being that the recipient will kind of tuck the book away and that Inglis doesn't want to impose upon them in giving her gift. But it also suggests that these were books designed as objects to be treasured, and treasured quite intimately. As Susan Fry noted, cabinets would typically be located in a closet or a bedchamber, and so Inglis is negotiating space for her books at the very heart of their recipients' lives. But hope for the storage of her manuscripts sounds differently again in this series of miniature books of psalms that she made between 1612 and 1615. As you'll remember, these miniature psalters are all written in imitation of a printed book, they fit within the palm of the hand, and they often have elaborate embroidered bindings. And for these, Esther Inglis envisions a more active reading process from her recipients. In her dedications to these books, she comments on their size and their materiality, explaining that she has made these choices so that a recipient can engage more easily with the scriptural words that they contain. So, for example, she writes to Prince Henry that the psalter she gave him should be convenient to be taken in your princely hand, and from the hand to be laid up in the heart. And to her friend Sir David Murray of Gorthy, she says that of all the white-clothed holy scriptures, it may be called most worthily the treasury and storehouse, night and day to be turned and revolved within the hand, worn and used in the mind, meditated and exercised in the heart. And this turning and revolving is as true of the physical book which fits within the palm as of the words written within it. So, as well as being precious gifts treated as spectacular and curious objects, Inglis' manuscripts also seem to be designed as devotional books which can play an active role in their recipients' spiritual lives. In the last section of this talk, though, I want to consider how far Esther Inglis' visions of response to her work may or may not have been followed through. So this brings me to the second body of evidence, later provenance inscriptions in the manuscripts themselves, and what this can tell us about how these books have been viewed and engaged with over time. Despite Esther Inglis never seeming to have presented herself as a teacher of handwriting, some of her manuscripts do show evidence of later readers engaging with her scripts as models to practice from. So here is a manuscript from the Newbury Library that contains selections from the Book of Proverbs. And you can see a reader practicing their own italic script using Esther Inglis' calligraphic text as their model. In this manuscript of religious poetry, which is now in the National Library of Scotland, a reader uses a blank page, which quite poetically also contains an impression of the flower that came just before it, to attempt a Roman minuscule script in the same as miniature as Esther Inglis' own. On another page of the same book, it's not Esther Inglis' scripts which seem to have inspired later engagement, but her flowers. So these floral designs respond to the pansies that are painted on the facing page. And this leads us to the idea that provenance in Inglis' manuscripts can tell us something about how these books have actually been used. And I think this can be broken down into several different categories. Internal evidence suggests that in different ways, these manuscripts have been used by their later owners educationally, devotionally, artistically, and domestically. So, for example, the miniature manuscript of Octonaire that is now held at St. Andrews has the intervention of probably two later readers, or at least two different hands. And the first of these clearly imitates Esther Inglis' fine Roman minuscule script. And actually what both of these readers are doing is translating the French verse that Esther Inglis copies into their own, making their own English translations. The second reader, we actually have a name for them. This is a woman called Elizabeth Sharp from the later 17th century. And so in this context, Esther Inglis' manuscript is not only a model for script, but also a source for French to English verse translation or translation of religious verse. And this same manuscript from now held in St. Andrews also shows what I think is quite a poignant instance of devotional engagement. The Octonaire sur la vanité et inconstance du monde, so octonaries on the vanity and the inconstancy of the world, are religious poems. They meditate upon the fleeting nature of an earthly life, setting this against the eternal and atemporal nature of the divine. And what we find here is that cutting a hole in the flyleaf of this manuscript, another reader has pasted into this frame a small circle of paper on which they've written the Lord's Prayer in a miniature italic script. In the later 16th century, writing the Lord's Prayer within the space of a penny was actually quite a recognised calligraphic challenge. We've got a quote here from the antiquarian John Stowe, and his chronicles report that the English writing master Peter Bales wrote within the compass of a penny the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, the Ten Commandments, a prayer to God, and several other texts as a gift for Queen Elizabeth I. Interestingly, a different Esther Inglis manuscript, now in the National Library of Scotland, also contains 3 pages on which another later reader has also written the Lord's Prayer out in miniature, twice within a circle and once within a square. So it might be that these readers are simply following in Peter Bales' calligraphic footsteps with their own experiments in micrography. But I think, especially in the case of the St Andrew's manuscript, the care with which this new element has been added and framed suggests there's something else going on. So many of Esther Inglis' books are produced with miniature dimensions. This manuscript from St Andrews measures just 5 by 7 centimetres. And this Lord's Prayer is a kind of miniature within the miniature. And yet, as a text, it is foundational, speaking to the heart of the Christian faith. Writing a text which encompasses so much in letters which are almost too small to read becomes a kind of symbolic act, an emblem of the idea that the source of all the devotional words within this manuscript necessarily lie beyond the book itself and can only be accessed by leaving that book behind. And I wonder whether this response also reflects some impulse behind Esther Inglis' construction of her manuscripts in miniature, condensing at times all the variety of creation, at other times all the wisdom of the scriptures into tiny objects which can be held within the hand. In a far less poetic kind of artistic intervention, or actually destruction, the floral manuscript now held in the University Library here has had nearly all of its painted illustrations cut out, perhaps for the collaging project of a later owner. We know, for example, that this fragmentation happened before the manuscript was bought in 1865. A blank leaf at the end of this same manuscript now also records prices for different weights of beef and mutton. So we're really moving away from the romanticism here, written in a late 17th century hand. On the right, you can see another manuscript by Esther in the National Library of Scotland, which now records the birth and the death dates of the Malone family in the later 17th century. And so in that example, an Inglis illuminated manuscript has become a kind of family album preserved through generations. And examples like these evidence then the many different lights under which Esther Inglis manuscripts have been viewed over time. Virtually all of them, as I say, began life as devotional manuscripts, with Inglis' hope that they would inspire particular forms of prayer or meditation, and certainly with the vision that they would be treated as treasures, often preserved in private cabinets. But as the years go on, these early intentions for a manuscript's use give way to new interpretations. And so we can watch as Esther Inglis' books become sites for handwriting practice, different forms of calligraphy, records of personal lives, and even domestic duties, as they are absorbed into the daily lives of their later owners. The other path which some of Esther Inglis' manuscripts take, though, is their accession to library collections. This includes the Royal Library, but also the Bodleian in Oxford. On the 11th of July, 1654, the English diarist John Evelyn reported a visit to the Bodleian Library, during which the librarian Thomas Barlow had curated some of the nicer curiosities to show him. Among these, Evelyn reports seeing a manuscript of Bede from the 9th century, a book that he says is written in hieroglyphics and he thinks was written on donkey hide, and, as he says, the Proverbs of Solomon, written in French by a lady, every chapter of a several character or hand the most exquisite imaginable. 2 of Esther Inglis' manuscripts had reached the Bodleian shelves just 30 years after her death. These Proverbs, which she made in 1599 for Robert Devereux, and also a miniature book of Quatrain of Guy de Faux, which she made for the Bishop Joseph Hall in 1617. And so 3 decades after her death, Esther Inglis' manuscripts are being exhibited as prized elements in the Bodleian's collection. In part, this develops David Brown's assertion that Esther Inglis' work is of national significance, not only because Thomas Barlow chose it for exhibition, but also because it was donated to the Bodleian in the first place. But it also demonstrates that 40 years after its production, this manuscript had moved worlds away from the devotional function which it originally held. In Evelyn's diary, then, we watch the transition in Esther Inglis' manuscripts from items treasured by an individual to items treasured by institutions. All good. John Evelyn's diary is only the second textual source that we actually have for Esther Inglis' reception, after David Brown's account of Scottish handwriting from 1638. And so this speaks actually to the relative obscurity into which Esther Inglis has fallen in the past 4 centuries. After 1654, mentions of Inglis, her life and her craft do appear in the remarks and collections of Thomas Hearne, for example, in 1719, and the memoirs of several ladies of Great Britain by George Ballard from 1752. But after this, there's a lacuna in printed records about Esther Inglis for about a century, until the 1860s, where we find her manuscripts exhibited in meetings of the Society of Antiquaries in London, for example, and surprisingly also the Kent Archaeological Trust. In Scotland, though, the first printed account of Esther Inglis to follow David Brown is an article by the antiquary and bookseller David Leng from 1865. This is his notes relating to Mrs. Esther Langlois or Inglis, the celebrated calligraphist. David Leng can be considered the first collector of Esther Inglis manuscripts. He conducted a lot of early research into her life and her connection specifically with Edinburgh, and his article records 28 pieces of writing by Inglis. It's actually David Lang who himself collected the 6 Esther Inglis manuscripts now held in Edinburgh University Library, having bequeathed his manuscript collection here after his death. But this is it. Very little additional research into Esther Inglis or her manuscripts seems to have been conducted over the entire course of the 20th century before 1990, excepting, of course, the appearance of her books at sales and amongst donations, which has led to their present-day geographic dispersion among libraries across Europe and the United States. It was the effective rediscovery of Esther Inglis by 2 bibliographers, Scott Elliott and Yeo, and the publication of their catalogue in 1990, which conceptually brought these manuscripts back together. The publication of this catalogue was game-changing for how Esther Inglis' corpus was perceived. Attributing 58 pieces of writing to Inglis, it finally emphasized the geographic dispersal of her books and allowed scholars to capture a holistic sense of the variety of her manuscripts, to make connections between them, identifying different groups among them, whether by binding, self-portrait, or textual content. And it was this catalogue which set in motion the past 3 decades of scholarship through which Esther Inglis' work is at last gaining the recognition and hopefully the place within our own cultural histories which she has always deserved. The title of my talk today was taken from my online exhibition, Rewriting the Script. And I think this phrase speaks pertinently to what Esther Inglis' manuscripts achieved within her lifetime and to how we should think about Esther Inglis 400 years after her death. On a literal level, Esther Inglis was a copyist. She was also an artist and an author, but her work as a calligrapher was to rewrite the words of others in the multitude of scripts that she mastered. Taking the scripts that she learned from professional writers, Esther Inglis' religious books turn these scripts to a new purpose. Through their rewriting, they become not just artistic tools or demonstrations of her skill, but means through which to read and know the works of God. Mastering more writing styles than anyone else of her time, professional or pupil, Esther Inglis also conceptually rewrote the script to the potential of all early modern scribes. Her books speak to the depth and the breadth of what the pen can achieve in this period, not least in the face of the rapid expansion of print technology. And as both scribe and artist, exceptionally well educated and known within the heart of the Jacobean court, Esther Inglis also endlessly rewrote the script for a woman's opportunities in late 16th century Scotland. But if Esther Inglis' work rewrites the script for early modern manuscript production, it's surely surprising that we do not have more of a sense of her legacy. On an individual level, we've looked today at the ways that Esther Inglis' manuscripts have been personalized over time, how these books have moved from gifts offered to noble patrons to sites of artistic, scribal, and sometimes devotional engagement, and how books which Inglis first envisioned as treasured objects to be kept close to the body have passed through many hands and been interpreted in many different contexts. With the rare exception of that Scottish prayer book, Esther Inglis does not seem to have cultivated her own tradition. We don't talk today about a school of Esther Inglis, for example, even as her manuscripts embody a convergence of artistic, scribal, and material practices to an extent that I've simply not seen replicated elsewhere. And to reflect on the afterlives of her manuscripts is in many ways to become aware of the silences which still surround Esther Inglis. The absence of life records for her as a woman, the silence surrounding how her work was received, the manuscripts that we know she made but which are now untraced, and her omission from scholarly publications until the later part of the 17th century, beyond occasionally recording her as a remarkable woman. And so the final rewriting of the script, which I want to encourage, is the script of a cultural history, particularly a Scottish cultural history, from which Esther Inglis is excluded. The work of the Esther Inglis project here at the University Library has been to raise this calligrapher's profile in as many ways as possible, through research, publication, engagement, and through the online exhibition. But I feel strongly that this is still just the beginning. There are more of her manuscripts to find, more of her life and networks to piece together, more studies in which she can be included, and more audiences who are yet to hear her story. And this process can begin right now. So after this evening, I'd ask you to take this work forwards, consult Esther Inglis' manuscripts yourselves, seek out those which are lost, and share what can be known about this calligrapher and artist who was so exceptional for her time and who time should not forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I've definitely seen some of these manuscripts before as the kind of nicest curiosities in the collection, but I've not known so much about them. So it's really great to hear so much more about them. The floor is open to questions, and also I'll be passing on any questions from our online attendees as well. So yeah, do go ahead.
Yeah, go for it. Very well manned, but I was wondering, something that really occurred to me when I was looking over there was the size of the documents and the size of the text within them. And I was wondering, of course, about whether there's a concern to the eyes, just working that small, straining the eyes. And so I wondered, my maths is very poor, so I wasn't sure how long she lived, whether any sort of like strain was clear maybe at the end, or if you knew anything about maybe her working conditions that helped that.
Yeah, in terms of her working conditions, I think it's very likely that she worked under glass, because especially her, maybe you saw the blue self-portrait, the one with the kind of blue background, that very much works within a tradition of miniature portrait paintings, and you might have seen the kind of ones that particularly circulate through the court in England, and they would have been produced under a magnifying glass. So my sense is that she would have followed those kinds of methods of production. In terms of So as I said, we do know that in the year 1612, she had a kind of significant illness, and she writes about that in her manuscripts, one of the ones that she gives to one of her closest friends. So there definitely would have been a sense of a kind of infirmity, possibly after that. Her lifespan, she lived till the age of 53. And I don't know whether that impacted the kind of work that she made in her later life. As I said, her calligraphic variety does diminish in the later part of her life, and that could be an explanation. But if anything, her books get smaller over time. So I'm not sure 100%. As I say, it's one of those interesting questions that to an extent, all we have is what's in the books themselves. So we can kind of try and untangle their construction by looking at them, but we don't have anything like a kind of inventory of the materials that she used or what they cost her or anything like that. So yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Yes, just at the front here.
You said she kept getting smaller and smaller, which is very impressive. But could cost of materials come into why she kept getting smaller and smaller? Was it like, obviously they're probably very, very expensive in the time?
It's interesting. One of the big decisions that would have been made in terms of cost of books at these times is whether it was made on paper or parchment. And so of her 63 manuscripts, 60 of them are written on paper and 3 of them are written on parchment. And that's interesting because it tells us that at some point that decision is being taken. So it is an active choice to work on paper. There were clearly moments in her life where she had access to parchment. her will shows us that she was in debt at the end of her life as well. And I can't be as specific as saying it was because the books cost a lot to make, but it is an interesting element of her story, that although she was kind of making books that found their way to the very heart of the royal courts, she herself kind of stayed in a sort of degree of financial precarity across her life. So again, I don't have the answer to that, but I think decisions about cost definitely would have factored in. I don't have the sense that she was kind of particularly sparing in her costs of materials. We can tell from some of the bindings of her books, for example, that she was using the same binder as also bound books for the royal court. So her connections to the artisans and the kind of craftspeople that she connected with were kind of, you know, the highest. And some of them you might have seen as well, the embroidered bindings on her manuscript. That's hugely skilled, hugely detailed work. Some of it is her own, but others would have probably been done on kind of paying someone else to do it. So maybe we can say she should have been more economical in her decision making, but I think these were books designed to be made at the sort of highest level that were available to her. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sorry, just right in the back there. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for that most marvelous talk. What was going through my mind was when you touched on the matter of Esther Inglis copying Flemish manuscripts in the Royal Library. It strikes me that the type of manuscript that she would seem to have gone for would be those in the Canton Bruges style, because the floral decorations are, in some of the ones which you showed on the slides, you could see the shading to give the impression of 3 dimensions. That's very typical of that type of manuscript, rather than simply French, for example. And I'd like to hear what you think about that. The other thing is that if she was looking at these Flemish devotional manuscripts, or even French devotional manuscripts, she was very selective in what she took from them. I mean, decorative borders with flowers and butterflies, that's fine. But where's the Virgin Mary? Where are the prayers to saints? Where are visions of heaven? Where are depictions of hell? That's not there.
No, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think you're absolutely right about the Gembruge school, and I'm particularly interested in that the miniature of David, in the possible Simon Benning, because it seems like there's such a close parallel. I can whip back because I just love putting these 2 manuscripts together. I'm sorry, Daisy. There we go. I don't know. I just think that I've looked at a lot of images of King David from this kind of later 15th, early 16th century period, and the particular posture here I find very striking. So I think you're absolutely right, not only about the school but also about the selectivity. And I think here we have to bring in the fact that her Huguenot belief was completely, from what we can tell in her manuscripts, was a completely guiding force across her life. So to that extent, she was very much identifying with a Protestant religious framework. And so I think, to me, what this says more broadly is how selectively people generally are looking at pre-Reformation manuscripts at this time. I wonder actually how far it would be seen as kind of controversial to borrow the kind of visual language of an earlier style of book if it's kind of absorbed into a Protestant devotional practice. For me, it speaks more to a continuity in artistic traditions, which maybe as kind of historians we need to speak about a little bit more. I don't know whether you would agree with that.
Yes, I would. Yeah. Yes, very much so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was interested by what you were saying about the printing press being a kind of threat to scribal, like sort of traditional scribal work. And I was wondering, I know you said it's difficult to kind of gauge the reception of Ingles's work, but I was wondering if what she was doing was ever kind of seen as a kind of rejection of that kind of move towards modernization, or if her scribal work was acknowledged as, like what you're saying, a kind of revolutionary and innovative way of sharing writing.
Yeah. One of my favorite things that she ever writes is in the letter that prefaces one of her little books of Psalms, and she uses this quote, which is used a lot actually in the early 17th century by different preachers, but also it has a kind of wider use as well. And she says, "This is a bookish age." So there's very much this recognition in kind of publications of her time that we're getting to the point that there are too many books. Obviously, partly it's used in a kind of rhetorical position. It's not like people are literally like, there are too many, but it's a kind of cultural concern. Like, print is expanding to an extent that are we going to just be overwhelmed with the publications that exist? And I think Esther Inglis' manuscript is one of two examples that I've ever seen of a scribe engaging with that bookish debate. So a scribe actually saying, this is a bookish age, there are too many printed productions. And I find that quite important from her. I think the fact that she uses that complaint, she says there are too many books, and this is the kind of book that I'm offering you instead, in a book that imitates print, it very much seems to be engaging with that idea that, well, on the one hand, there's nothing that can be done, nothing that print can do that can't also be done by hand, and to an extent done better by hand, but also she's very much aware of the context in which she works and the context of that becoming an increasingly print-driven one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I find that really wonderful from her. And as I say, it isn't something that I have seen scribes reflecting on all that much. Yeah.
One of the things that sort of struck me a lot, possibly because I'm very neurodivergent, is that it feels like a very tactile sort of thing, and devotionally, I was thinking in sort of Catholic countries you've got rosary beads, but that wouldn't have been so acceptable in a more Protestant culture. So maybe doing something else is sort of, I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but it struck me just how tactile. It's the kind of thing where I could imagine just sitting there with a book and not necessarily reading it, but having it there to feel almost helps with the devotional thought process, if that makes any sense. I absolutely love just sitting there with old books and feeling them. There's something about them that is incredibly tactile, and somehow it helps to, even if you're not reading it, think this feels very much like that, and sort of yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but it's sort of, yeah, that's probably it. It's sort of this very meditative factor, and like the embroidered covers would feel very tactile and you can feel it and then maybe go to your favorite bits, and if you're using it very often it kind of almost feels like that personal gift, because in neurodivergence there's something they call pebbling, of giving a gift that gives the nice sensations for the brain, for lack of a better thing. And it's hard to phrase, but that gift is, here's the thing I thought you would like that would make everything feel nice and help, and it has a certain feel like that almost.
I think you're absolutely, well, how I perceive these books, I would completely agree with you. I think the fact that like the embroidered bindings, I mean, they are incredibly tactile, because the embroidery is not just done with threads, it's also done with beads and what we would now say a sequins. So that it really does have a kind of very kind of tactile, very kind of somatic effect to engage with them. And I think that quote that I picked out where she said that it's to be turned and revolved within the hand, the fact that that book would have then had such a textured surface as well, I think there's definitely something there. Her smallest ever manuscript actually is made for her son, and it's literally like 3 centimeters by 5 centimeters. It's absolutely tiny, and the embroidery on both sides has worn away. And so, to me, this very much suggests that it is a book that has been turned over time, and the kind of the wearing away on both sides tells you something about the kind of engagement that it's had. I had something else to say here. Yes, which is that similarly actually to the idea that earlier, the kind of illumination of earlier books kind of carries on into early modern Protestantism. I think we can start putting that engagement with materiality into that sort of same framework. So I think you're right to pick out the connection to something like a rosary. And to me, what this says is actually that the Reformation and the kind of the religious change that happens, you know, sort of middle part of the 16th century, doesn't actually affect the way that people engage with books as much as perhaps we thought it did in the past. I think there is that kind of maybe essential impulse towards the material and towards the tactile, and using that in a kind of devotional framework that sort of endures as an impulse into the later 16th century.
With the delicate changes to sort of suit the religious thing, like sort of they haven't got the Virgin Mary things, which the Protestants were very much part of that is against a lot of the Catholicism with the saints and all of that. So it kind of feels like she's doing something similar but appropriate for the beliefs of the time as opposed to where she's getting inspired as well.
I think that may well be true. I think it's hard to know how far she is taking those decisions herself and how far it's kind of part of a general sort of zeitgeist, or kind of how people were still engaging with older books or older traditions at the time. But I definitely think that we can align her work with something that's going on a bit more generally in early modern Protestantism, which is less of a kind of hard and fast break with what came before than we may have thought it was.
I'm mostly a medievalist, so I look at the sort of medieval side more, but it's
Interesting
also
to see
really
where these things go,
fascinating.
though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much.
I've got a couple of questions online. I'll just jump to them and then back into the room. So Graham Lyle has asked, has any of Inglis's work been published in facsimile? Is that planned as a result of the project?
The manuscript in St Andrews, actually, they have just produced a facsimile. I know that it has a shelf mark. I assume that means it's open for consultation, but absolutely that's something they are doing. And also the Folger Shakespeare Library, they have done a facsimile of the embroidered binding, and they've there's some needlework historians who they've kind of analysed the work and replicated the processes and the materials as well. So absolutely that's something happening there. I'm going to say that was beyond the scope of this particular project, but it's really wonderful. Actually, what has been great to come out of the last year is having made connections with all the other institutions worldwide who hold Inglis manuscripts, and we can kind of see this as a collective work, you know? Yeah.
And Meg Ford asks, are any books owned by her known to survive?
Any books owned by Inglis? Oh, no, they're not known to survive, but I've got a list of all the printed books that I know that she read, because she kind of quotes from them or copies from them or whatever. And so every time I go to a new library, I'm going to check through as many copies as I can find. I mean, it's a huge amount of work, right? But not currently. But honestly, every time that I open one of like John King's sermons, I'm like, is there going to be Esther Inglis written on the top there? So unfortunately not. But if anyone finds one ever, let me know.
Yeah. Any other questions from the room?
I wondered what happened to this kind of calligraphic tradition going forwards, rather than thinking about moving back into the medieval period. Does she have imitators or comparators into the Restoration era, or is this a way of operating in a bridge between a scribal and a print world, which, and I don't think anyone thinks that scribe is out the window because print is expanding in the 17th century. They're working together, but they're working differently after the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I say, there isn't a sense really of kind of close imitators of her work, other than that kind of one prayer book that I brought up. I haven't seen much there. I think there's an interesting connection, and it probably isn't like an actual link, but there's an interesting conceptual link with what starts happening in France in the middle part of the 17th century. So the school of Nicholas Jarry, for example, and this is I think they are Catholic books. There's a lot of parallels. They are like miniature, beautifully illuminated, often very closely replicating printed text in them. So as a kind of impulse, like a creative impulse, it definitely does seem to carry on, but I don't know of any kind of causal links there. We actually have out a handwriting manual from Scotland from the later 16th century, and you can have a look at that and see kind of how far the scripts that are being demonstrated change. But generally speaking, I don't know. I wonder whether we can talk a little bit more about like more of a divergence, because we have things like the development of copperplate handwriting and kind of, you know, we handwriting maybe in its kind of swirls and its elaborate nature moves a little further away from imitating printed books. That kind of imitating print, for me, it seems like very kind of clustered at the sort of first half of the 17th century and the later part of the 16th. But yeah, I'm not sure I have more. I don't know. It's not something that I've looked into much actually, but absolutely something that I'd like to. Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm an artist, and clearly she is very much more talented than me. Are there any surviving examples of her trials and her work? Because clearly that pose being mirrored, she obviously made a note of it, and then I'm assuming she did several trials to get it right, and then playing with the colours and the composition, and even just learning the different scripts. And I know if I pick up a new tool, it takes me a while to get familiar. I'm guessing if she's trying to gift something to someone, she's not going to want those sorts of mistakes. So is there any sort of surviving examples of her methodology or her trials?
Yeah, it was so great if there were. I mean, as I say, it's one of those things where pretty much everything that we know comes from the book, so kind of comes from the finished products. One of the manuscripts that we have out here, the one that's had all the illuminations cut out, the flowers, they were quite selective because they left 4 flowers in, and I think they decided that they were the ones that were of a slightly lower quality than everything else that was being snipped out. So we do get glimpses of like degrees of perfection, you know, kind of degrees of skill within her manuscripts, but everything is a final product. So yeah, I think it's one, again, it speaks to that kind of tension, which is frustrating for me and probably for you as well. But the reality is that everything that we know is a sort of very curated, very kind of carefully put together decision that she kind of got to. But you're absolutely right to point out the fact that she must have kept lots of different copies of things to refer to throughout her life. And that stands not only for the imagery that she used, but also specific parts of the text as well. Yeah, thank you.
Any final questions? Great, thank you so much, and thanks to Anna. Before we go and consult the manuscripts, just a reminder that the next talk in our programme will also be held here at the University of Edinburgh, as well as streamed online, and it will be preceded by our annual business meeting. So following the ABM, Thomas Rees-Clark will be presenting on his University of Edinburgh Book Collecting Prize winning collection, The Left Book Club. That will be in 4 weeks' time on Thursday, the 20th of March. We hope to see you there. If you're new to the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society, I've got some programmes, so do feel free to take one on your way out. If you are heading over to look at the manuscripts, if you have any bags with you, can you just leave them by your seats? That would be grand. And yeah, just to say thank you to Anna one more time.